So now let's talk a little bit about like money. How do we get paid? Who gets paid? What does that look like? And what are the ways in which different parties might be able to benefit from access as a model? Louisa, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So both Kaitlyn and I thought it was really important to start with the first point on the slide, which is that any access participant is excluded from billing Medicare Part B on a fee-for-service basis for care that's rendered to the beneficiaries participating in access. That exclusion extends not just to the access organization, but any organization that has a formal affiliation with an access participant, which is defined, the most relevant definition is an organization that has greater than 5% ownership in the access participant. So if you are a health system and you have greater than 5% ownership in an RPM or an RTM company, and that entity is looking to participate in access, you either have to make the decision that you're not going to participate in access or really have some strict guardrails around when fee-for-service is billed for that participant, because there are some carve-outs that are challenging to administer, and getting in the weeds there is beyond the scope of this presentation. But we do want to call this out because basically when you choose to participate in access, if you choose to go within access, you have to recognize that you're not going to be able to bill that participant for Medicare Part B on a fee-for-service basis. That's important note number one. However, on the exciting end of things, you do become eligible for the outcome aligned payment, which is a flat payment amount that's going to be established for each separately for each of the 4 tracks, that is based upon your ability to deliver the results that are established within those models. And we'll talk about the particular mechanics behind that a little later on. And then finally, the model comes with third-party incentives as well. And when we say third-party incentives, these are incentives that apply to other entities. So for example, primary care practices that can serve as a referral source within the access model, and also patients themselves. For example, copay waivers for patients that waive their responsibility to cover the copays that are traditionally been associated with, as Kaitlyn mentioned, RPM and RTM entities that bill Medicare for those types of services. So that's a high-level overview of the 3 kind of key categories around payment within this model. Kaitlyn, do you have anything you want to call out?
Yes, I still have so many questions about the OAPs. I think the big one, when CMS first announced access, I think one of the first things you and I talked about, Luis, was, okay, this sounds great, but like, how much are those OAPs actually going to be? How much will participants actually make if they're replacing all of the fee-for-service billing that they can do for these patients? Is that OAP actually going to cover what they would have had if they were billing fee-for-service? And, more importantly, maybe, is it actually going to cover their costs associated with managing these patients, particularly those higher risk patients? So, that's an outstanding question that I don't think we know the answer to yet. There's some information in the RFA from CMS that indicates what we might expect, but we don't know yet for certain how much those OAPs are actually going to be worth. So, if you're thinking about, do I become a provider if you're a digital health company, or, if I am already a provider, do I apply to participate in access? I think you'll probably want to start, if you don't already have it, getting a really good understanding of your current financial basis for the services that you provide to patients that might be access patients. Because you're going to want to be able to make a quick decision. Yes, we apply. No, we don't. But in order to do that, the clock is kind of ticking, right? We don't yet know how much the OAP is going to be. So you can't really run a cost comparison or a revenue comparison yet. But if I were you, I would start pulling the information so that you have a good understanding of your cost basis as well as your current revenue and profit margins when you treat those patients, so that when we finally get that OAP amount, you can make a quick decision to say, yes, this is going to be better for us. No, this is going to be worse for us. Or, it might be slightly lower margins for us right now, but we think it's really good for patients. So let's do it and see what happens. So, I would start sort of gathering that information internally. And then the second thing I want to say that I think is really important is the third party incentives piece. So really exciting to see CMS explicitly saying that you can waive copays both for access patients as well as any copays associated with that co-management fee. That's great. That is the first time that I've seen CMS really say that you can waive copays outside of very specific federal regulations that already exist. This is a little bit of an exception to that. What they've basically done is they've said there's this safe harbor out there, and we think that this safe harbor is going to apply here, even though it's not explicitly written into the regulation. So that's really exciting. Keep in mind that copay waivers also mean that you are collecting less money for the services that you provide. Does not mean that CMS is going to pay that additional 20% that typically constitutes the copay. So keep that in mind as well. All of that being said, it's probably worth it, but just keep that in mind. It's going to change the actual amount that you make for the service you provide. And then the co-management fees are really interesting too, because they are exactly what you said, Luis. They're essentially a payment for a referral. CMS is saying if you are not an access participant, but you have a patient that could really benefit from treatment by an access participant in one of these 4 clinical tracks, one or more of these 4 clinical tracks, and you take the initiative to send your patient over there, and then you help get the patient onboarded with that access participant, and you make sure that the new provider has the information that they need, we will pay you. We, CMS, will pay you for making that referral. I imagine a lot of my clients who are watching this are like, oh, okay, Kaitlyn, so have you been lying to us about AKS? The answer is no. You still have to, whoever you are, whether you're a digital health company or a provider, everything you do still has to comply with the anti-kickback statute, with beneficiary inducement prohibitions, all of those things. But there are already safe harbors that allow you to do that. So there are already established ways in which you can make that happen and still take advantage of these third-party incentives. So really exciting piece of this model that, like I said, I think is another one of the reasons that I'm so excited about access, because I just don't think we've seen it in a way that truly makes sense. That truly makes sense for the way that care is delivered. So yes, very exciting piece of this. Really excited to see how much those OAPs end up being. Let's talk about the actual mechanics. So we talked about OAPs being payments for outcomes. Luis, what does that actually mean?
Yes. So, of course, I will get into the mechanics, but the big question mark is what's the final dollar number that's attached to these OAPs? I would encourage folks, if you look at the request for applications document related to access, there's this mysterious Appendix F that was included. It's not cited once within the document itself, but it does contain a lot of research into what the conditions that are managed and part of the clinical tracks cost Medicare on an annual basis. And that does give kind of a baseline for what Medicare is thinking. I think in general, it's safe to assume that Medicare wants to keep 50% of any savings that you're able to generate. So keep that in mind when you look at that data. And I would encourage folks to look at what reimbursement looks like for RPM, RTM on a 12-month annual basis, toss in some E&M codes, and you probably might get a decent sense of what OAP might look like. I'm going to give you all my guess. This is not an informed guess by any stretch of the imagination. I just did some playing around with CPT codes, and I am guessing that you're going to see somewhere in the neighborhood of a $2,000 to $2,500 per year OAP for tier 1 initial period care, and more along the lines of a $1,500 to $1,800 per year OAP for tier 2 care. That's just a wild guess, but I want to put it out there and see how my guess compares to reality. So what do I mean by tier 1 and tier 2 care? Well, the outcome adjusted payment itself is going to come in one of 2 tiers. It's going to be a single dollar number that's established for tier 1, which is going to be greater to reflect the fact that the initial work associated with a patient is larger. You're going to educate them on the use of the devices or whatever care modality you're using to care for patients. You're going to have some greater initial assessment of an intake associated with the patient. So that tier 1 payment is going to be higher than the tier 2 payment. The tier 1 payment is going to apply for the initial period, which is going to cover 12 months. And tier 2 is then going to apply for that beneficiary thereafter for their participation within the program. Those dollar amounts, this is really important, are going to be subject to a 50% withhold. So if the dollar amount is, let's say, $2,000, 50% of that amount is automatically going to be withheld by Medicare. The remaining $1,000 is then going to be distributed on a quarterly basis. So you're going to get $250 at the end of quarter one, $250 at the end of quarter two, the remainder of that period. So off the bat, you as an entity are taking essentially 50% risk associated with the payment. And beyond that, the payment itself is going to be spread out quarterly in equal buckets. So there is a significant amount of cash flow lag related to participation in this model. And that seemed to be something that was intentional on the part of CMS. They were looking for partner organizations that were willing to take on kind of that cash flow risk relative to what you typically see within a fee-for-service model. So you have that lag. And then we come what happens to the remainder of that outcome-aligned payment, the remaining 50% of that payment? Well, the release of that 50% is going to happen after the end of the annual period for which that beneficiary receives care. So in the example I gave where payment is $2,000, $1,000 of that is going to be withheld. The reconciliation regarding the withhold of that $1,000 is going to happen at the end of the year. So you're not going to have the opportunity to see that cash until at least 1 year after that beneficiary has been cared for. The way that release is going to be administered is through what are referred to as clinical outcome adjustments and substitute spend adjustments. So Medicare is going to look at what are the clinical outcomes you have attained related to the care that you've delivered to those patients. And they're going to do that by evaluating predetermined outcome measures. For patients for which they are looking to see improvement on clinical metrics, Medicare is going to establish a minimum clinically meaningful threshold for which you've achieved improvement. Or for patients that have conditions, but you're looking to maintain control of those conditions, Medicare is going to establish a threshold of clinical control. So for example, if you've got patients with really high A1C levels, they're going to establish here's the minimum threshold that demonstrates improvement. Or for patients that are pre-diabetic, but you're maintaining control of those A1C levels, here's the minimal control threshold associated with those measures. To the extent that your average performance demonstrates attainment of those measures, Medicare is going to adjust payment or is going to release payment for those measures. So if you achieve the minimum threshold on average for all patients, then you get 100% achievement on that clinical outcome adjustment. So you have a 0% adjustment, you can earn that full payment. As your attainment of those measures decrease, then the payment scales downwards, and there's an up to 50% reduction on the full OAP amount. So essentially, Medicare can withhold up to 100% if you don't hit any of your improvement thresholds for any of those patients. There's a second category of adjustment, which is referred to as the substitute spend adjustment. And basically what this is doing is Medicare is saying, did you avoid any sort of duplicative spend associated with care for these patients? So did you make sure that, hey, patient that's participating in this access model, that they didn't have an RTM code dropped for managing their condition from a separate provider organization? And basically, Medicare's threshold here is we want to make sure that 90% of your beneficiaries did not see any CPT codes that are considered part of kind of the access bundle of care dropped for these patients. If the rate of billing for those patients exceeds 10%, then there's going to be downward substitute spend adjustments. That's going to be capped at 25% of the OIP amount. And then finally, Medicare is going to compare the two numbers and say, was the clinical outcome adjustment greater than the substitute spend adjustment? Yes, then we're going to apply the clinical outcome adjustment as the decrease in the withhold of that $1,000. Or was the substitute spend higher? Okay, well, then we're going to apply the substitute spend adjustment to apply to those payments. So a lot of this is hard to describe verbally. The RFA does have some good examples. I also recommend running your questions by some of the large language models out there. They do a good job of answering questions about those scenarios. But essentially, that's how, in a nutshell, it's going to work. So basically, what you need to be doing is you need to be ensuring that you're hitting your clinical outcome targets, because that's going to be the larger kind of decreasing model. And you need to have discipline around making sure that your beneficiaries are not receiving the same type of care that you're providing to those beneficiaries from another separate Medicare organization and dropping CPT codes for those patients.
Whew.
So with
Yeah, you got to get those finance people on board, because like, it's clear to me, Lisa, you understand everything you just said, and it was very clear. But I'm just thinking about if I had to be the one to like figure out what our payment was going to be and what our risk level was, it would be a challenge. So super interesting, lots of complexities there. And, you know, this is another reason why start getting your finance people in right now, start looking at your numbers, start thinking through this in a really detailed way so that you have a good idea of whether you can take on this responsibility or not.
Thank you for joining us and exploring the details of the Access model. We invite you to watch our other videos on the basics and paths to success in the Access model. Welcome Outreach if you have any questions.